Welcome back, everyone. So, today, the question I want each of you to sit with is whose risk is it anyway? Not on the org chart, not in the owner field, but in practice, in your building, in your department, when a decision needs to be made, who owns that risk? Because the answer to that question tells you everything about whether the program you built is actually governing anything. What's good, Army's crew? I'm Jada, and this is Let's Talk IRM. Today we have Meesh to keep us straight. So, Meesh, let's get started.
So, what is the earliest sign you see in the platform data that tells you risk ownership was configured before the organizational conversation happened?
That's a good way to start, huh? I remember I was working with an org in the past, and there was a lot of risk data within their application. And the first thing that I noticed about their risk data was that it was all assigned to the same person. There was no variance in ownership, there was no variance in entities. It was all one entity, one owner identified, and there was like 30 risk in the risk register. And to me, when I see that, that's the first sign that somewhere, for some reason, risk ownership was configured as a part of the implementation before being decided as an organization. So, what that means or what that tells me is that we need to take a few steps back and understand why that was done. Was it a communication error? Was there a lack of support from leadership? Got to understand what the root cause that brought us there, because ultimately, if we do not have those organizational conversations to define our risk ownership structure, we're going to have problems with adoption. We're going to have problems with properly tracking risk within IRM that meets our expectation.
Can you show me what that actually looks like in a risk record?
Yeah. So when you open up the risk register or the risk list in IRM, what you would want to see is that you have your entities defined. So on top of understanding how you're structuring your entities, you also want to have your risk context identified. So that would be like our risk statements or how we are governing our risk structure. So we would want all of that defined ahead of time. This is not a part of configuration. This is a part of the strategy that we adopted as an organization, and we're just transferring it into the platform. So I
Yeah.
would like to see these risk statements properly filled out and properly assigned out to the appropriate entities. And then those risk owners properly tied to the risk records that are generated when the risk statement gets assigned to a control objective. So we don't have to be perfect and have everything filled out, but if we at least have our risk context defined and our entity structure as well as ownership structure, that's a good start for us to maturing our risk management program. Without those components, I feel like we
Yeah.
shouldn't be touching the platform at all.
So, can you take me back to a specific moment where you realized an org leaders thought ownership meant something completely different from what the program required?
This is actually probably a quite frustrating situation to be in, honestly, is when
Yeah.
you come in, as an implementer and you have clear instructions on what needs to be implemented. But then at some point, you realize that there's a disconnect between you and the organization or among the organization members where they all have their own version of what a risk owner is or what a risk is. And to me, that's a cultural issue. That tells me that the org's risk management program is vulnerable because we across the board, there's inconsistencies on what that definition is. And that also tells me that it's probably not a risk focused organization, which is another red flag. Because when you're implementing a tool like IRM, you're saying that, yes, we want to have a more risk focused approach to adhering to compliance, to analysis work, to making informed decisions. And if our culture is not a risk first approach, we're going to stumble and have complications. So,
When you see a risk register fully populated, But organizationally follow, what's the first thing that you do?
Can I run? Is that an option? No, no, I
No.
wouldn't run. I would probably want to, but that's why I'm there, right? I'm there to help. So your question is telling me basically that I've come in, this risk register, wherever it lives, is fully populated with several risk items. We have owners, we have dates, it looks great. But then before seeing it or after seeing it, when meeting with org leaders or the risk management team and asking questions and they're unable to answer, that tells me, okay, something is up because obviously someone at some point in time was dedicated to the risk register. And instead of embracing it as an organization, the organization decided to put that responsibility on one person, or it ended up where one person volunteered and the org decided not to reevaluate how they want to communicate and enhance their risk management program beyond one person. So for me, I would want to understand, okay, how did we get here? What decision allowed for this sole person to take full commitment of the risk register without engaging with anyone else within the org to help them understand how risk management is done? I would figure out what decision caused us to be here. Was it because we were going through an implementation that asked us hard questions and we just decided to settle on something without creating an intentional plan of coming back to? Is it that's the org's position? This is because this is how we do it? Like, what was the context behind that decision? Because that really sets me up to understand the culture of the organization. Are they
Yeah.
rigid? Are they more likely to, bend a little and change or manipulate their processes to help mature it along?
I have a question from the community. Okay.
Okay.
This one came in from a practitioner who is 6 months post go live and recognizing this pattern for the first time. So, the question is, I just finished an implementation where we assigned risk owners in the platform before the governance conversation happened with org leaders. The engagement is ending in 60 days. At this point, is it too late to fix the ownership model or do we have to start over?
Honestly, I really don't think anything is ever too late, depending on your perspective. That's just my optimistic mindset, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm more of a glass half full kind of gal. So, is it too late? I don't think so.
Mhm.
I think 60 days is enough time to turn things around because you can set up ownership in production. Your users can set up ownership with the right roles. I think as long as you communicate the knowledge, communicate that's associated with not doing the job that they need to do, then I feel like you've done all that you could. And aligning and making sure that you meet your SO requirements and have documented proof, I feel like is a solid way to protect yourself.
Can you walk me through what you actually say to org leaders when you need to define what risk ownership requires of them? Not in the platform, but in their day to day work.
Yeah, I think it depends on the org, on how rigid they are or how open minded they are to making changes. Because I've experienced it on both sides. So, for an organization rigid in their ways, they don't understand why they need to do X, Y, and Z, which is require risk ownership or define risk ownership. So, for me, I would kind of tell them a little bit more blankly of, if you don't define who your risk ownerships are, you're going to find yourself responding to every situation reactively, trying to find who does what within the organization and holding them accountable for it. And you'll get a lot of responses where people that says, that's not my job. No one told me I'm a risk owner. I'm not willing to accept that. Like I have had that conversation where some people are like, yeah, I'm not the risk owner. I'm not taking on that heat. And I'm like, okay. And I've had leaders tell me that. I'm like, I'm not asking you to take heat. What I'm asking you is, are you the risk owner? And they want to throw it on a lot of times the CISO. They say, no, the CISO is supposed to be the owner. Anything that's related to cyber, that's the CISO. That's not me. And that's a huge misconception. To me, that's a vulnerable risk management program. Because the example that I have is, say you're in a hospital system and you're running, I don't know, Windows 7 for whatever reason because medical tools require it. And the CISO is saying, hey, we need to upgrade to Windows 11. We got to do it. And that org leader is like, well, we can't because our medical devices need to be at Windows 7 so that they can provide support to our patients. In that example, the CISO is not owning that risk. The business leader is because they understand their business context. They understand that if we upgrade to Windows 11, it's going to break our process, which means the value add that we provide to our customers is going to be broken. So, that to me is how I would explicitly explain it to anyone that's rigid in their ways of trying to understand, why do I need to define a risk owner? Who's supposed to be the risk owner? Now, for an organization that's a little bit more open minded, we usually have a bit more fun talking because they're asking questions. They want to know what is the responsibility. They're eager to find that knowledge, and then they want
Yeah.
to kind of see how that aligns with their current org structure. So that would be a little bit more of a easier conversation to have. And so I would be like, okay, so we need to define risk owners for XYZ departments. The risk owner is going to be that strategic partner that understands the business context. They understand the cost structure of that department or their processes, the impacts, the value add that they bring. So they would understand the department, the process full circle. So when it comes to an incident that's happening, this is the person that is going to be making that final decision of, this is how we're going to resolve the solution. Go and do it to whoever their issue resolvers are. So that would be more of a educational type conversation that, in my opinion, is quite enjoyable for me. Because then I don't feel like I'm going on an uphill battle of trying to convince people why they need a risk owner.
Is there a difference between an org leaders who do not know how to own risk and those who know but choosing not to? How do you tell them apart?
Okay. So thinking back on just past projects and past orgs that I've been to, for me, what I see are those that are apprehensive to say, I'm not the risk owner. That's not my job. I'm not catching that heat. Those are the ones that I feel like that know to a certain extent what it means to be a risk owner, but the organization hasn't fully defined it for their organization. And they certainly haven't communicated to whoever those risk owners are. So as a result, when you're trying to get information for evaluating a risk, you get apprehension and it's hard for you to get the data you need. And it makes the risk analyst's job very difficult because they're there to collect data for proper analyzing so that the risk owner can make an informed decision. Like they're there to help, but they're almost seen as
Yeah.
the bad guy, in my opinion. Now, for those who do not know, those are the ones who kind of blindly respond to risk assessment. To them, that's just a compliance check, a check in the box where, oh, I have to do this because XYZ compliance or regulation says I have to.
I want to read a question from the community that speaks directly to what we're talking about. It's coming from
Uh-huh.
a consultant navigating the ownership gap in real time. So they said, every time I try to define process ownership with org leaders, they defer back to me. They want me to tell them who should own what. So at what point do I just make the call so we can move forward?
So this is interesting. I like this question because it's telling me that the org is trusting the consultant to lead them down the right path. And I think that is very critical for anyone that's coming in to help an organization implement IRM and mature their risk management process because, for one, they're trusted. Now, the org is seeing them as that individual, that entity that's going to help them get this project moving along. So, in that particular situation, I would definitely do like a workshop of explaining to them what process ownership looks like for a workflow like IRM. Because if you
Yeah.
ask the question just as basic, who is the risk owner? The organization may not fully understand how to answer that question. They might ask, well, what do you mean? In that moment, that is the implementer or consultant's opportunity to baseline with them, define what that risk owner is, and give them a foundation that is solid for them to land on when it comes to building out their process. So instead of asking them, what is a risk owner? Make it scenario based question. Ask them if a risk event were to happen, say a cyber breach, happened within the HR department. Who are the personnel that are going to be responding to that event? Along those lines, I'll probably say, of course, the SOC, the cyber SOC, the CISO, but there's probably going to be HR leader in that mix that they're going to identify. And when they come across that individual, when they define them and say, these are the people who will show up, that's who you tell them. That is your risk owner for the HR department, for that particular department within HR. Because not only do they understand what their tech stack is for the department, they understand the business context. So if you told that leader that their workday solution is going down for whatever reason, they want to know about it because they probably have processes, HR processes involved in it. And they want to know how many of their processes are affected. They want to know, does this impact us financially? So that person would be able to get access to that type of data. That person would be able to understand where they live at when it comes to how risky, how impactful this event has become. So to me, that would be the way in to an organization and explaining these heavy concepts with them that they don't understand. When I go into orgs, and I have those scenario-based conversations with them, they usually get the aha moments because that's where I'm putting the context in a relatable position for them. And then they realize I had no idea. And then that's how you could start moving forward because now we're all on the same foundation together. They trust me. And now we can move on to the next phase of probably breaking down more concepts, which is always fun.
I like that for the workshop. So you've seen consultants fill the ownership vacuum rather than guide the org toward it. What is the long-term cost of that choice for the org?
So during implementation, the org was given a task. Come back to the implementation team with your defined entities, orgs, whatever, how you define it, with the owners across them that monitor the risk. They're risk owners. And the org didn't deliver. The implementation team can't sit forever because there's only a certain amount of time that they have to complete the job. And so what happens is they just kind of put someone there. So they might fill it with the first org leader that's involved in the project, or they might even put themselves just to get past the configuration part. And I understand that tendency. It's because you have a deadline that you're trying to meet and you have responsibilities, right? Now, the problem with that is there isn't an intentional plan to go back to resolving that issue. So if we just blow by that decision and just let it linger without a plan, what could happen is, say the implementation team leaves and the org doesn't understand why that certain decision was made. They'll look at their risk register and they'll be like, I don't understand. Why are all my exceptions owned by one person? Why do I have all these entities, but all my risks live on this entity? They won't understand it. Now, maybe you documented, I hope you documented that decision. That's a good approach. They keep tabs of what was done and why, but not having an intentional plan to let the org know that, hey, we need to circle back to this at XYZ time, because if we don't, these are the implications to that. The second cost is that the org allows risk decisions get made for them. And honestly, you can't do that. You can't have outside entities make decision for the org. That has to be owned by the internal leaders that understand the culture, the environment, the regulatory requirements, the current deviation, the current landscape. They have to own that. So allowing an outside entity like the implementation team to just establish source of truth and ownership as in your IRM product without having those key business conversations, it's a misguided step to having to respond to an auditor down the road of, well, you said XYZ is the risk owner, but they're not here. Explain that. You're at risk of getting a deviation or a finding. The key point that I want to leave listeners here with is that there needs to be an intentional plan. You can't control everything, but at least have it documented and communicated that, hey, we all agreed to come back to this on XYZ date for the purpose of XYZ. That will set us up for success. So when that time comes, we can have that intentional conversation that needs to be had.
When the org keeps deferring and the engagement clock is running out, is that actually a sustainable position?
It's overwhelming, I would say. And this is why I give a lot of applause to implementation teams, because sometimes being in that situation is stressful when you know you need to get this key data and the org is just kind of like, it's all right. But as an implementer, this is important. Defining our risk is important. So that's where I would go back to the documentation. You can't force everything, you can't control everything, but you can make an intentional plan and document it and have documentation to support the actions and the decisions that were made, because ultimately you are going to leave. And when someone or a customer is going to be less than satisfied, because there's chances of that, right? You have the
Yeah.
documentation to show, hey, this is how we tried to remediate the issue. This is when we communicated it. And this is the result we got from the designated meeting. So documenting is kind of like your safe way of, okay, we're going to keep moving on, but make it clear that, hey, we tried, the org dropped the ball on this. It's out of our hands now.
So this one is from a practitioner on a large enterprise engagement, and I think it captures attention of the people in this space. So the question is, my org is nowhere near ready to run automated risk assessment. They are still manually tracking everything in spreadsheets, but org leaders expect everything automated by go live. How do I manage that gap without setting them up to fail?
I've seen this so many times. And it's because the sales team, they do a really great job of selling a product, and everyone wants automation. Everyone hears the term GRC engineering and they're like, we want that. And same with AI, we want that, right? But then
Yeah.
no one wants to look at their dirty house or that dirty closet and actually pull things out and see, okay, what do I need to do to improve my situation, to allow me to absorb these cool new features that I'm seeing? Because if you just have a broken process and you put automation on top of that broken process, you're just going to automate a broken process. Same with AI. You throw AI on top of a broken process, it's going to highlight that problem with so much confidence. I think that's the funny
Mm.
part is people are like, AI isn't accurate. And I'm like, well, it's just reading off of what you fed it, right? So if it's not accurate, probably you. So when it comes to this situation, you really have to have that realistic conversation with the business on maturity
Yeah.
level. There is the crawl, walk, run, fly analogy that ServiceNow uses. That works
Yeah.
with technology implementation, but that also works when you're talking about your business workflows. How do you assess the state of your processes today? So when they say they're in spreadsheets, okay, what are we doing with these spreadsheets? Does everyone on the team have their own individual spreadsheet that they're tracking? Or are we sharing this spreadsheet across other departments? Are we working in silos? Like, these are key questions to understand the culture of the organization. Because a lot of times when we're in spreadsheet wonderland, there are different versions of the truth across different departments. And everyone gets offensive when you ask who's the source of truth because they think they're the source of truth. And that might be part of the truth, that might be part of the story, but everyone gets their information from somewhere else. We need to identify the state of where our process is. What processes are worth automating right now? Kind of like, what are my low hanging fruit? Identify those processes that are in better shape, that are good candidates for automation, and then tell your clients, okay, let's prioritize automating those. We need to do it in phases. While we're working on the automation of this workflow, you need to declutter XYZ flows next. Your second level work processes that take a little bit more commitment to understand the who's, the what's, and the whys behind it, and ensuring that it aligns with what the business requirements are or the regulatory requirements are, so that we can transform it into an automated process. And then that's how you drive the conversation on prioritization and actually level setting what can be automated and what is not ready for automation.
Tell me about a time you tried to guide an org toward ownership and it did not work. What happened and what did you learn from it?
Oh my goodness. So I remember that I was working on a project and it was going downhill. Things were just not going well. And I say that because the implementers needed certain information from the business, and the business leaders were not involved in the implementation. So they were speaking to the individual contributors, the people that do the work. The implementation team had no leverage to tell them what to do. And since the org was very rigid, those individual contributors had the mindset of, that's not how we do it today. So I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going, no, that's not my job to make that decision. And the worst part of it was that the implementation team was having weekly calls with the business leader and trying to articulate this issue. And the business leaders would take it in and they would say, okay, we'll come up with a decision and send it your way. And they never did. And to me, that's an org that's not taking ownership. That's an org that spent all this money and they're not valuing it. And why? I have no idea. It was a really bad experience, in my opinion. And what happened is that the SO was met. The implementation team brought everything in the SO. The unfortunate part is no one used the tool. There was no user adoption. When the time came to ask people, why aren't you using the tool? When they say, I don't know how. That was their reasoning. They didn't know how. And org leaders tried to put it on the implementation team. It didn't work because they had documentation. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like,
Yeah.
to think when you purchase a tool and you provide such a large investment, you want to make sure your investment is being used appropriately. Like, you don't want to waste the org's money. And so for me, this is why I always tell org leaders is that before you purchase a tool like IRM, make sure you have your ducks in row. Make sure you know who your support team is going to be. Make sure you know you have the right support above you if you're not the decision maker in a tool like this. Because when we talk about risk management, it's a cultural thing. So we're not just talking about plug and play tool here. We're talking about how we're evolving our risk program. And that takes a heavy lift and needs a lot of people to come around with an open mind and the willingness to change.
If a practitioner comes to you and says, I know the org needs to own this, but every time I try, they push it back to me. What do you actually tell them to do?
When I've come across that in the past, I really had to lean on my leadership team to make that decision because I can't make that decision for them. I can provide advice, recommendation, experience, but I really lean on them to understand that, hey, we want this to be more than an expensive spreadsheet. We want to make informed decisions. This is one of the tough calls that we need to start making is we need to define what is risk across the organization. What does it mean to be a risk owner? What does it mean to be a control owner? Like each of those definitions, everyone has their own opinion, which is all right, but we need to have documentation, policy, standard that drives the risk management process for the organization. And it's really going to take the org leaders to do that. In my experience, when you don't have that support, it makes things very hard. So I wouldn't imagine an org wanting to just spend money and just wasting it. I mean, I can't speak for everyone. To me, that would be the hard conversation I would want to have with my leaders of, hey, we need to level set for a second and why.
So now to the community question,
Okay.
where they said, I am a consultant. My engagement ends in 30 days. The org's risk ownership maturity is nowhere near where it needs to be. I flagged it in every status update and org leaders never acted on it. Do I walk away knowing I named it? Or is there something more I should have done while I had access?
Mhm. I would want to know if this status update actually had a conversation that explained why this is so important. And did you receive feedback when explaining why it was so important? So saying that leaders never acted on it, that kind of tells me it was just more of a update on like a roadmap project and never really fully discussed. If they did have the conversation, right,
Yeah.
and explain the why and still chose not to act, then at that point, I feel like you've done everything that you could. It's out of your control. To me, that means that you can walk away cleanly knowing that you did what you could. You rose the issue, you documented it, you had times where you communicated it, got feedback from the leaders, but they still did not act on it. At that point, there really isn't anything else that you can do. I mean, you can lean onto your leaders if you're on the implementation side, but again, they would track that in documentations too. Maybe they'll go in and they'll have a conversation with the leaders. But ultimately, I feel like with 30 days left, you've done all that you could.
So, is there a version of the ownership problem that cannot be fixed without an org chart change? Or do you believe a good enough practitioner can create the conditions for ownership, regardless of how the governance structure is set up?
I think that you can still move forward without having an org chart change. So every organization, you ask that org leader and they'll tell you, yeah, our infrastructure, our business is complicated. Everyone thinks they're complicated. I've heard that sentence so many times. Now, the difference between a decent practitioner and a knowledgeable practitioner is that they're able to consume how that organization is operating and find patterns or relationships that they can consistently identify who the risk owner would be in a situation. And to me, that doesn't mean you're dependent on the org chart. That's more dependent on the conversations that you have with people and understand, well, when problems arise, what happens? Who responds to it? If something wants to get purchased in this department, how does it get done? Who's supposed to sign off? Like, you understand that you need to ask those business key questions so that it surfaces the identification of the patterns and use that as a guide to explain to them on how they can follow. And to me, when you define your risk ownership structure, it's not set in stone. It's something that's constantly evolving. If there's a reorg that happens, there's buyouts, there's new products coming into play, that could shake an org chart. So if your risk ownership structure is dependent on an org chart, that might make it a little too rigid. It really takes a knowledgeable practitioner to understand the context of the business to surface the relationships that can make ownership consistent.
Oh, we have another community question. Yay. Before we get into what good looks like, I want to bring in one more question from the community because it gets exactly this. How do you know when it is working? So their question is, OG's risk program reference, ISO and NIST in every conversation, but nobody on the team can tell me what controls they are actually evidencing against those frameworks. How do I shift the conversation from framework names, actual evidence, without making org leaders feel like I'm questioning their compliance program?
So I actually love this situation. A lot of time when working with org, you notice that there's a knowledge gap in how to run an integrated risk management strategy versus an org that is already there and mature. So a lot of times when I'm speaking to compliance individuals that are talking about their requirements, it really does stay at that framework level. Like, even when I ask them specifically, what are your organizational controls? They resort back to the ISO or the NIST framework. While, yes, those are frameworks that do help guide you to improving your information security program, they are not your organizational controls. They are not the what or the how of what you're doing to meet that requirement. So I love to talk in scenario basis. So say we're talking about an access control, right, to the building.
Yeah.
Walk me through how someone gains access to a building, a new hire, tell me. And sometimes they'll say, well, there's the onboarding process. They have a background check that they do. After the background check completes, then they have to get a username that's generated and then identification card. And I tell them what you just said, it's several controls built for one purpose to prevent the risk of an unauthorized user accessing your organization. How do you do that? We conduct background checks on all new hires. That's a control. We issue unique user ID to new hires. That's a control. All users are given a physical key that identifies them when they access the building or to access the building. That's another control. Those are your organizational controls. Those controls roll up to your framework that show thou shall have access control requirements. In these particular situations, I get a lot of aha moments where everyone's like, oh, that's what you mean. And then they start to understand, oh, so IRM is really holding me accountable to surface what I'm doing instead of just repeating what the framework is saying. And I say, that's exactly it. You get it. You got it. Now let's do that for every single other control. And that is what I love about those conversations because they realize this is really going to help us in a lot of ways.
What is one thing a practitioner can do this week? Not a framework, not a methodology, one concrete thing that moves the needle on ownership in their environment.
One thing is understand who your risk manager is. Get to know them. Have a conversation with them and understand how they have defined the risk appetite for the organization. How do they come up with that decision? And how do they communicate a risk first culture to the organization today? I feel like that's the one starting point if it's an immature program or versus a mature program, is that having the risk manager as your collaborative agent can help move the needle forward on any blockers that arise or any gaps that need decisions for.
Thank you, Jada, for answering some of these difficult questions, and I hope the community enjoyed and can take some experience from that in what you said. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I want to highlight that your facilitation was phenomenal today, and I look forward to our next conversation on Let's Talk IRM. Let's Talk IRM is a Sassy Boutique podcast. If you're looking to go deeper on how to implement IRM as a strategy and as a ServiceNow application, we're building something for you. Head to thesassyboutique.com to join the waitlist and be the first to know when it drops. Connect with me on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and follow the show so you don't miss what's next. Links are in the show notes. But until then, my friends, let's keep making sense of IRM one conversation at a time.